Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Woodrow Wilson and later Franklin Roosevelt and the USSR. This is really interesting, and it shows that there is a kind of an evolving and quite complex and oftentimes quite confused relationship between these figures and what they perceive to be happening within Russia after the October Revolution. And a lot of what follows, a lot of the diplomacy and the, in some ways, quite cordial diplomacy from the White House towards the Soviet Union during the Paris Peace Conference and after, and then during the Great Depression, when Roosevelt is in office, is based on these assumptions, is based on beliefs that are fostered from within the administrations of these two Democrat presidents about what they think is happening in the USSR. So the first place to start really is with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was quite keen for the USSR to attend the Paris Peace Conference, but during 1919, the entirety of Russia is in chaos. It was very, very difficult to ascertain any kind of realistic picture of what's going on in Russia. Communications are very difficult. There is transport links have broken down. It's impossible for many people to get in and out of Russia, and such basic amenities as telegrams and a postal service in most of the country, because of the Civil War, have collapsed. Actually communicating with the new revolutionary government is very difficult. The attitude that Wilson has towards the new revolutionary government is quite ambiguous. He looked upon Tsarism as really an abomination. When Woodrow Wilson commits America to the war in April 1917, it comes 2 months after there has been what appears at face value to be something of a liberal democratic moment in Russia. Tsarism has fallen, and a provisional government has been put in situ, which is going to be a caretaker government until there can be elections for Constituent Assembly. So this all seems quite positive. And it helps people like Wilson and Lloyd George to rebrand the entire war effort as now a struggle of democracies against despotisms. Not that really the Kaiser's Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were despotisms anything like, or anything on the scale of Tsarist Russia. But this convenient story, now that the Tsar has gone, can be told. And both Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George have little sympathy for the Tsar and little sympathy for the ruling classes of Russia, and believe really that they kind of got what they deserved. The anti-communist in chief after October 1917 is, of course, Winston Churchill, who is perhaps one of the few figures that seems to really understand what the West faces with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are this small and very obscurist radical sect, if you will, that is very poorly understood in both the Western world and also in Russia itself. Not many people have heard of Lenin. Lenin, when he bumps into members of the public in the streets of Moscow after he's seized power, there are people that have no idea who he is. This is the kind of the shaky foundations that government is on from 1918 up until really the end of the Civil War. The excesses, the murderous excesses of the Bolsheviks and the horrors of the Civil War are transmitted to the West by the various writers and journalists who stay on and during the Civil War, people such as John Reed and Arthur Ransome and other figures. A lot of it isn't believed. Much of what they're writing saying now is demonstrably true, that this was a horrifically bloody conflict where atrocities happened on all sides, and the Bolsheviks were very often given the benefit of the doubt by people like Wilson and people like Lloyd George, who preferred to think that, and whilst neither of these men were communists in any way, shape or form, and we mustn't ever go down that route, they rather hoped that what they saw emerging was a period of terror that would be followed by some kind of moderation, some kind of readjustment, some kind of end to the radicalism, and some kind of development of a, hopefully at some point in the future, a liberal republic. Now this sounds hopelessly naive, and it sounds that these people have been taken for a ride by the Bolsheviks. They were kind of the useful idiots, as Lenin would later describe the fellow traveller movement. And you can, by the way, you can check out the podcast I did on the fellow travellers. It's I think about number 40 or 50 or something like that. But it's well worth a listen, if I dare say so myself. But we shouldn't be too hard on Wilson, and we shouldn't be too hard on Lloyd George either, because what we're essentially saying to them is that they were fools for not predicting Stalinism. Well, none of us can do that. People like Winston Churchill seem to be incredibly prescient when it comes to predicting the rise of Hitler or observing that the Soviet Union would be this immensely murderous regime. But he is somebody who said a lot about a lot, much of which was wrong, and he's also part of a class of conservatives with a small c who thought Mussolini was rather great for much of his time in office. So the Wilson administration had hoped that there would be some kind of representation of the Russians at the Paris Peace Conference. People like Clemenceau believed that the Russians should receive no recognition, for they had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Russians had, under the Bolshevik government, had allowed the Germans to put hundreds of thousands of men into the West in order to launch the Ludendorff Spring Offensive. In fact, actually, it looks like now that that's not quite what happened. The men who fought in the Ludendorff Offensive were cherry-picked really from existing divisions in the West. There were fewer people moved from east to west than perhaps we think. But that's by the by. What Clemenceau conveniently ignored was the fact that had it not been for the Russian offensives of 1914, the Germans would have been in Paris within 6 weeks of the launching of the Schlieffen Plan. So the Russians did have, a very important part to play in the final victory, even if they had exited the war by that point. Lenin was not particularly interested in attending the Paris Peace Conference, and he was happy to publish the secret war plans hatched by Lord George and Clemenceau over the Middle East. The Tsar had been CC'd in on all of this and had been promised Constantinople and the Dardanelles. And there was a sense that Lenin was causing as much mischief as he could in order really to portray the Western powers as the imperialists he perceived them to be. By 1917, there's been this profound shift away from popular imperialism in Britain, France, America, and other combatant powers, is seen as really part of the kind of the black magic that has caused the war. So Lenin really does his best to cause a great deal of trouble for the Allies. Two members of Wilson's inner circle, William Bullitt, the diplomat, and Lincoln Steffens, the journalist who knew US journalist who knew Russia very well, went to Moscow in order to see if US Bolshevik relations could be established. Lincoln Steffens was, of course, famously one of the fellow traveller movement who was a great enthusiast for communism, never quite a member of the party himself, but was famous for saying, I have seen the future and it works. He was able to kind of ignore the uglier side of communism, the violence and bloodshed that he saw in Russia, by saying that herein is a country going through a revolutionary transition. And here's where Wilson gained a lot of his insights into the condition of the new Soviet regime. He was given very sympathetic accounts by people like Steffens. And later on, interestingly, Roosevelt was similarly beguiled by Stalinism through the American fellow travellers who would return and visit the White House and tell him about the achievements of Stalinism and the hope that Stalinism was going through a radical, violent phase and would settle into something far more progressive eventually later on. One of the characters that Roosevelt deferred to was Anna Louise Strong, who had worked as a journalist in the Soviet Union and was enamoured with the place. She came from a devoutly Christian background, and she viewed the emergent society in the Soviet Union, even though it was secular, even though it persecuted the Orthodox Church, as some kind of development of God's work in the world. And she was so passionate about communism that she actually returned to America at the height of the 5-year plans in order to interest American businessmen in investing in Russia. The Stalinist regime was quite interested in developing large American auto plants, particularly on the Volga River, and in return they were able to export gold. This gold is obviously all dug in places like Kolyma by Gulag slave labour. And Roosevelt quizzically asked Anna Louise Strong, where all Stalin's gold came from. And I'm not sure she gave him a particularly thorough answer to that one. It was one of the great ironies that in 1949 she's actually arrested by the Soviets as a spy. From the mid-1930s onwards, this kind of rather cosy toleration of Westerners coming to view the great experiment in the Soviet Union dissolves into a into a Stalinist xenophobia and suspicion. And there are a great number of American fellow travellers and economic migrants to the USSR who vanish into the Soviet camp system. She managed to extricate herself from that, but during the McCarthyist period of the late 1940s, early 1950s, is viewed with immense suspicion back in the USA as well. Roosevelt and his view of Stalinism shows an interesting kind of continuity with the Wilsonian period, and obviously Roosevelt is the naval secretary and then vice presidential running mate under Wilson. I'm not suggesting for a moment that Roosevelt simply absorbed Wilson's ideas, but there is a certain kind of compatibility in that they looked upon the emergence of the Soviet Union as being something far more benign or far more optimistic than that which actually emerges. And the reason for this, I guess, is that both men had this universalist, this American sort of universalism, where they were kind of hoping, Wilson at the end of the First World War is hoping that an American model of the future might emerge. You might have independent, free nation states liberated from imperialism, cooperating with one another, with constitutions, popular sovereignty, and free presses, civil rights, and free trade, free access to the seas. And from thence you create this 20th century, which is like utopian 20th century. After the Second World, and obviously, let us not forget, involving the League of Nations as the supranational body moderating all of this. The Roosevelt view of the world, whilst never quite articulated in something like the 14 points, Roosevelt never writes down the Roosevelt Doctrine. Instead, he has, I hope, after the Second World War, yes, there will be a United Nations, but there will also be, it's slightly less utopian, that there will be a series of spheres of influence between the great powers, which would, in Roosevelt's hope, be Russia, America, China, and the United Kingdom. Roosevelt certainly didn't want France involved in all of that. He was not a Francophile in any way, shape, or form. Roosevelt, both Wilson and Roosevelt, hoped that the Soviet Union would emerge as a credible player and almost partner within their respective new world systems that were going to emerge after these titanic conflicts. And unfortunately, in both instances, in the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union plays little part in regulating world affairs, and after 1945, it emerges as an antagonist to the United States. Both presidents, I think, are perhaps guilty of projecting rather naive notions onto the USSR, but let us not get into a kind of a sense of inevitability about what the USSR may or may not have become anyway. It's possible that the USSR may have had a moment where it could have emerged and evolved as a more liberal, or to use, or more moderate regime. Quite possibly, the events of the Civil War and the perception of the Soviet Union being surrounded perpetually by enemies as a result of its revolutionary birth made the chances of a moderate and less paranoid regime very, very slim indeed. Anyway, I hope this has been useful, and if you are studying this at the moment and you want something a bit extra, you might find it useful to look at Chris Kostov's The Communist Century, which you can find on my website, www.explaininghistory.com, and I'll post a link to it at the end of this podcast. Anyway, thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.